So today is week 2 of our Learning Burst sessions. Please remember that next Wednesday we will not have the Learning Burst. It will be the following week. We will be in person doing training next week. So we're so happy to see you guys and actually see you in person. Woohoo! Happy about that. So at this point, I will turn everything over to Kyle. And remember, if you have any questions, anything like that, please put them in the chat. Emma and I will look at those and we will make sure that Kyle gets those so he can answer everything for us accordingly. So without any further ado, Kyle, please take over.
Yeah, thanks, Sharonda. So as Sharonda said, it's the second learning burst, and we're going to talk about gardening pests because a lot of the questions in the chat last week and the interest from y'all last week was surrounding some different garden pests. So whether that's deer or insects, we'll talk about some really common ones, and I'll try to answer all the questions y'all had in the chat last week as well. But again, my name's Kyle Hood. I'm the Garden Collaborative Extension Associate with the Sets of Health program at North Carolina State University. And yeah, let's talk about some garden pests. So here we have a cabbage that's been eaten by something. I was actually just looking at my cabbages in my garden, and they're having similar issues right now. So we'll kind of dive into some different ways to troubleshoot different garden pests. And the first one we'll talk about, and there's a lot of questions in the chat last week about what do I do about deer in my garden? And I just kind of put on this slide, deer, the king of garden pests, because to me, if you have deer problems and you can't figure them out, then you can't really have a garden. Because if you have enough deer, they'll eat every single thing you plant, besides maybe some mint or some herbs here and there. But if you have enough deer pressure, which is what deer issues are in your gardens called is deer pressure, you can't really have a good garden. And there's really two different ways to deter deer. We have some mental barriers for them, and then physical barriers, and maybe a combination of the two. So I'll kind of guide you all in some different ways to deter them. But while we're on this topic, even the best physical barrier, like a fence. I was the garden manager at the Child Development Center Garden in Boone about 10 years ago, and we have a nice fence there. The deer didn't really want to get in the fence. And then one day, one of our garden interns just forgot and left the fence open. So we get there the next day, deer have come in and eaten everything in the garden. And we use it as a teaching moment because the deer was nice enough to leave some hoof prints and some poop. So we made like almost a detective game out of it for the kids the next garden lesson, and what happened to our produce. But even the best barrier, like a fence, one mess up and deer can swoop in. So yeah, definitely one of the most annoying garden pests in my opinion. So the first way to repel deer, and really a lot of the different mammals we're going to talk about, and some of the insects too, is repellents. So when we're in a school garden setting, we want to be careful what we're using, right? So a very popular way to repel deer is using capsaicin spray, so a spicy spray that's almost like mace that's going to burn their mouth when they eat your garden produce. But if I have a 3 and a 4 and a 5-year-old playing in my garden, and I sprayed this spray on there yesterday, that's a disaster waiting to happen. So this one that I'm going to focus on right here is called fish emulsion fertilizer. And this is one of my favorite organic fertilizers. It's a 5-1-1, so that means it's mainly nitrogen. But unlike a lot of inorganic fertilizers, it won't burn your plants. So you can spray as much as you want on there and it's not going to hurt the plants. And most plants either absorb fertilizer through their leaves or through their roots, like through the soil. And this is cool in that it can be absorbed both ways. So you can spray this on the plant's leaves or on the soil. The plant will get it both ways. But as the name implies, it's made with dead fish. So it doesn't smell good. You can have, kids explore this, smell it. It gets a big rise out of them. We're recycling these fish to feed our plants. A lot of good lessons in just showing them what this fertilizer is, how to use it. But it's going to make my plants smell kind of like dead fish for a few days after I use it. And deer and squirrels and just about any mammal that's eating my plants is not really going to want to try a dead fish plant. So it's going to help them realize, okay, this is not a place I should be getting my food. I'll go somewhere else. But a heavy rain will wash this sin away. So unlike the capsaicin spray, it's not going to be dangerous to have, this in your garden if there's young shorten in it, but it's not a permanent solution, more of a short-term solution. So then we look at some physical barriers. One that I wanted to mention is a floating row cover. I think I mentioned this a little bit last week. And this is a floating row cover on a very large scale, but they sell these floating row covers that are made for garden beds too. And you can buy kits very inexpensively for this. And it's really meant to extend the growing season as its first function. So let's say I don't want my plants to get frost on it. I know it's going to drop below 32 tonight. My tomatoes would die if it got that low. So I put a floating row cover on the bed. It solves that problem for the night. But this will also keep out deer and squirrels and really anything that you're worried about getting into your garden. And you could keep this on all year. Light does penetrate it, so plants are still going to get plenty of sunlight through it. I worked at a garden that was a pretty large scale, and they had these on every bed specifically to keep deer out. Got great results. It is just a little cumbersome to take it off every time, but it's probably a 2-minute job to take it on and off. So not a ton of work to keep deer out, relatively inexpensive compared to some other physical barriers that we're going to talk about as well. This is another one that's a dual function. Its first function is not to keep deer out, it's not to keep squirrels out, but it's a cold frame. And essentially, this is a plant bed with a window on top. And this is really going to extend your growing season. You could grow spinach and kale and leafy greens in December and January in North Carolina if you have a cold frame. So it's almost creating a greenhouse for your singular garden space or garden bed. But when those windows are closed, and you could close them every night, deer obviously cannot get through those windows. They're not even going to really try. That is the nice thing about deer, is that like for these last two, they're not going to spend a lot of time trying to open up your garden beds if you have them closed off. So these last two, again, are not really meant as their first purpose to keep out deer, but they'll do the job. And this is probably the main way to keep deer out, but also the most expensive way to keep deer out. So if you want to ensure that deer are not going to get in your garden, you need about a 6-foot fence. And they can technically still jump over that, but that's about the height where they're not really interested in putting that much effort into it. It becomes a little dangerous for them to jump over it. So you want about a 6-foot fence. There are ways to get around that height requirement. I've had 4-foot fences in my garden where the deer couldn't really see over them very well. And if they can't see on the other side, they become scared to make the jump because they're very dependent on their legs and the health of their legs. So if they think, well, I could get injured, I could injure my legs jumping over this, I don't know what's on the other side, or you have a lot of trellises that would make it hard to find a landing zone, they're not really going to be excited to jump in your garden. So either that 6-foot fence or an area they can't see into or feel unsafe jumping into, that's your best solution to keep deer out for the whole season. And again, like you can use all these methods, and in one night, maybe the fish emulsion gets rained on, your plants don't smell like it, deer will come and eat everything. So having a permanent solution you can really trust will give you some peace of mind gardening, at least. I had some questions last week about groundhogs. Groundhogs are similar to deer in that we keep them out of the garden in a lot of the same ways. Obviously, they can't jump as high as a deer, so the fencing requirement becomes a lot less strenuous for you. So now we're talking like a 3 to 4 foot fence will keep them out. But the top of that fence should be maybe curved back so where they can't just easily climb over it, because they will do that if you have enough groundhog pressure. But they can also tunnel underground. And that's where a lot of the damage comes in. So you would need to bury some metal fence underneath your existing fence, maybe a foot and a half underground, to keep them from just sort of tunneling underneath your fence. Repellent works well for them too. So again, that fish emulsion is a good short-term solution that has a dual function. Capsaicin spray is a great solution in your home garden, but again, when we're working around little kids, that's probably not the best idea. They make sprays that smell like rotten eggs, specifically for horticulture use on your plants. So that's another good solution. That's not maybe going to harm the young children in the garden, but will keep Mr. Groundhog at bay because he's not going to want to eat rotten eggs for breakfast, right? So removing brush is important as well. They like to make their homes in brush piles and sort of dig underneath that so predators can't see where they're living. So if you clear out all the brush around your garden, they're less likely to reside there full time. Groundhogs can cause a lot of damage, not just in the garden, but on your property. So if you have really bad groundhog issues and they're sort of destroying your property and your garden, you can contact a wildlife damage control agent. And if it's bad enough, they will trap the groundhog for you and take them elsewhere, sort of removing that problem for you. So we had some questions about squirrels last week. Squirrels are difficult to control because they can climb over any fence you have. Even if you have the best 6 foot deer fence that deer and groundhogs can't get into, squirrels not really going to have a problem getting into your garden. So with them, it's about knowing what they like and don't like. They love when you just plant seeds. If you have a bunch of squirrels in the area, they might even be watching you plant these beans or pea seeds, and they're really excited that when you leave, they're just going to go get all those beans and peas. So one thing you can do is you can cover fresh seeds you plant in the ground with some sort of deterrent to keep them away. I have this plastic green fencing that I like to use that I sort of cut it to make a makeshift cover for my garden beds if I'm having squirrel issues. Chicken wire is a good one. That can be a little sharp though, so it's not as good of a solution if there's young children in the garden. So having some physical barrier on top of fresh seeds, if you know there's a lot of squirrels in your area that are going to come and steal your seeds. They don't like mint, onion, and hot pepper, so that could also deter them as well. Those sprays are good deterrents too. Capsaicin spray in your home garden, fish emulsion, probably at your childcare center would be a better option, I think. So we had some questions about ants, and ants can be difficult. So the main way to get rid of ants, whether it's in your home garden, your lawn, is the same, but the products you use are going to be different. So if I'm having ants in my garden, messing with my garden beds, making their mounds there, you want to make sure whatever bait you're using does not have chemicals that you don't want to ingest. So on the back of any ant bait, it's going to tell you if it's a good choice for vegetable gardening. And really you want to avoid acephate, which is in a lot of ant bait for lawns. So an ant bait for, let's say, a vegetable garden is going to have spinosad in it, which is organic pesticide, which you can feel pretty safe using that. The one thing when you do bait for ants with one of these products that's safe in the garden is you want to be sure that's the time the ants are really moving around looking for food. So you can do this with your class. You could cut up some, fresh strawberries or, a sugary fruit, put them in your garden. And if by the next day it's covered in ants or ants have carried it off, you can be pretty sure that ants are feeding a lot right then. And it's a good time to bait. So really finding one of those baits that's safe for the vegetable garden is your best choice. But it still takes about 2 to 3 weeks from the time you bait to the time you're going to see some results and see less ant activity in your vegetable garden after you bait. Cabbage worms are a notorious garden pest. The picture of cabbages I showed you all on the first slide, that damage was from this cabbage worm. This picture on this slide is actually some red Russian kale, one of my favorite kale varieties. Cabbages like to feed on all those cold crops, so cabbage and kale are some of the main ones they feed on, radishes too. This time of year, they're just sort of coming to life. And actually, white butterflies, cabbage white butterflies, land on your plants and they deposit their eggs on the underside of their leaves. And so those eggs hatch right about now where I'm at, and very small cabbage worms that almost look neon green just start destroying all these crops. Again, I just found three, maybe 10 minutes before this call on my kale, and uh, they're very easy to miss because they look just like cabbages. So if it's your first time growing cabbages, you might not even notice there's cabbage worms because they're sort of burrowing inside until it's too late because they're meant to blend in. So keeping the butterflies off of your plants in the first place is a good way to stop them from messing up your cabbages and kales. So maybe that floating row cover. There's lots of different ways, or you can inspect your leaves very often. But even in a few days, they can do a lot of damage if you maybe missed some of the eggs on the underside of a kale leaf or a cabbage leaf. Flea beetles are another big problem this time of year. They actually have multiple life cycles each year, so you'll think they'll be done with your garden. A few months later, their second generation this year will come and eat a lot of your produce. They're very small and they do act very much like a flea. So if you touch them, if you touch the leaf near them, they'll just jump to another leaf. They're very hard to get your hands on. And you know they've been around when it almost looks like small shotgun holes in the leaves of your plant. So maybe a kale that has a bunch of small holes all in a little section, kind of like this picture. That's when you know you have flea beetle issues, and they do hang around your leaves too. So they're pretty easy to spot. Having some neem oil that they don't like it keeps them off of your leaves, or some organic pesticide is really your best bet because they can really destroy your crops in a matter of days. And with any of these insects and pests, I wouldn't be spraying organic pesticides probably at all, but especially not until I see damage or I see it's an issue, because that's really a learning opportunity for the kids at these childcare centers. Is oh well, we actually have flea beetles. Let's examine them. What's their life cycle? How can we control based on their life cycle? And you could have whole lessons on each insect that's messing with your garden this year. And even from year to year, if I just spray insecticide, there's going to be massive differences in garden pests just from year to year, just sort of natural cycle of things. So I would never suggest just spraying pesticides without knowing what you're treating, especially in a kid's garden at a childcare center. So I've talked about some pests and some ways to control them, but I also want to give some general gardening tips because this is the time of year where we're getting excited about lots of different summer vegetables. In almost all of North Carolina, we could be planting squash and beans and tomatoes and a lot of our favorite vegetables we think of when we think of gardening, and we might be prepping our beds for the first time this year. So a few things to think about anytime you're prepping your garden bed, whether it's in early spring or, this time of year or fall, you want to at least add 2 inches of organic matter to your beds each year. Compost is maybe the easiest way to achieve this. You can buy compost maybe at a local plant store or from Lowe's, or make your own compost. But whether it's compost or decomposed leaves, some organic matter getting back in your garden bed, it helps the soil quality, but it also acts as a fertilizer in its own way. There's lots of nutrients in compost, or composted leaves, things like that. And you also want to think about fertilizing your garden beds when you're preparing them too. I like to use an organic fertilizer that's equal parts nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus. So let's say if it's 5-5-5, that would be a balanced fertilizer that's going to be good for almost any plant in any stage of life. So finding a good organic fertilizer that even the kids at your childcare center could learn about, could help you put in the garden with the compost, maybe mix around the first 3 or 4 inches. That bed's going to be pretty much prepared for that growing season. Let's say your tomatoes will do much better because there's more nutrients for them, especially plants like tomatoes and squash and peppers. They need a bunch of nutrients from the soil. They're almost like sports cars of the garden. So they need a lot of nutrients. So being sure that you're adding fresh compost, things like that every year will help ensure you have good results towards the end of the summer. And while we're thinking about putting plants in the ground right now, it's also important to think about sunlight requirements. This is not maybe the first thing you think about when I'm, let's say, putting a tomato in a garden bed beside my house, but it's very important to think about what I'm planting, where it's going, and how much sunlight that area gets every day. So for all the ones I just mentioned, beans and tomatoes and squash, we need 7 to 8 hours of sun every day in that spot for them to produce well. And they might be twice as productive if they're getting that much sun, even if you cut that back by a few hours. So knowing where your garden beds are located, maybe you have 4 beds and maybe they get different amounts of sun. Just thinking about what goes in what bed based off how much sun is getting is important. So leafy greens don't need much sunlight. 3 to 4 hours is enough to grow kale and spinach. And then thinking about like carrots, potatoes, things like that, they need at least 5 and 6 hours a day. So just understanding where your garden beds are located, how much sun they get, can really boost your production without you having to think too much about it. We talked about broadcasting seeds last week. Maybe you have 2 and 3 year olds at your child care center, and it's hard for them to plant individual seeds in the ground. Broadcasting is a great way to get them involved in the gardening process without maybe those small skills like putting very small seeds in the ground one by one. And really it's just throwing seeds onto a garden bed. The best seeds to do this with are small. So think of basil, dill, even cilantro. You could honestly mix those three together and a little seed mix and throw it into a garden bed and throw a little bit of soil on top. And you'd have a bed of all three of those herbs at the same time. It'd be very easy just to broadcast those seeds. And I said consider polyculture when you're broadcasting. So that would be an example. So growing a bunch of things together that like growing up together. And the nice thing about, let's say, a basil and cilantro and dill mix is that you can eat those plants when they're young at almost any stage of your life. So if I throw 100 seeds in a space where only 10 mature plants can fit, well, now I'm eating small dill plants, small cilantro plants, and small basil plants for the next 2 months as I sort of thin that space out and make space for those mature basil plants and mature cilantro plants. So broadcasting is great to sort of get the little ones involved in a really easy way to plant a lot of seeds at one time. So we had a question about succession planting last week. And really all succession planting is having a good plan of your garden from spring to summer to fall and maximizing that space. So in this example I have on this slide, in spring, in this one patch of soil, we're putting in spinach. And then by the end of spring, spinach is done for. It's trying to make flowers. It doesn't taste good anymore. So we could remove the spinach and plant watermelon seeds or watermelon plants in that same space. They will, create watermelons by the end of the summer, at which point the plants will die. We'll take the watermelons out and our fall crop in that spot will be kale. So in that same spot, I've had 3 different vegetables over the course of that one year, which really maximizes the space. So just kind of understanding the life cycle of plants, what grows well when, can help you get a lot more bang out of your buck in terms of your actual gardening space. So we talked about crop rotation last week, or there was a question about crop rotation last week. And Really, crop rotation is simple, but it also takes planning. So vegetables take certain nutrients out of the ground. Like a tomato takes a lot of nitrogen, potassium, and calcium out of the ground. So if I put my tomatoes in the same place every single year, eventually I'm going to be at a big deficit of those nutrients. Even if I add them to the soil, um, I might not be adding them fast enough to replenish them. Tomatoes take a lot of nutrients in general. They're really needy because they're growing so much big fruit. So having a plan where I rotate which plant families I plant in a certain place each year can help with that. So I have this example on here of 4 different plant families or kinds of plants that you could rotate if you have 4 garden beds. That's a really simple way to do it. But even something as simple as, rotating my tomatoes and my beans every year, because beans don't take as much from the ground and they actually put nitrogen back into the ground. So even if I just said year one, I'll plant my tomatoes, in my first bed and beans in my second bed, and year two, I'm going to flip that. That would be better than doing nothing and just putting tomatoes in the same place every single year. This can also really help with pest control. So something like a squash vine borer, which is a terrible insect that will kill your squash plants. It bores into the holes of your squash plants and kills the whole plant. There's almost nothing you can do about it besides treat it before they come. Those squash vine borers, they live in the soil underneath the plants they just infested. So if I move my squash plants, 20 feet over next year, those little squash vine borers are going to have a really hard time, if not an impossible time, making that 20-foot distance without getting eaten by a bird or chickens at my house. So it can really reduce the pest damage and the diseases that you have too. Because something like a tomato or potato, if they get blight, that stays in the soil. So if I'm rotating it around, uh, there's a less chance of them getting blight, multiple years in a row, things like that. So again, this is something you think about before you plant anything in the ground, or maybe, this is your first year having a garden, and then next year we could just sort of rotate everything. But there's a lot of benefits to crop rotation that I can't possibly cover just in this slide. So now that we're thinking about plants and thinking about planting maybe some summer vegetables right now, I wanted to highlight heirloom seeds and rare seeds, which are kind of one and the same. But essentially, an heirloom seed is just a special variety of seed that's been handed down through generations because it has special qualities, right? And most heirloom varieties are not going to be available in the grocery store because a lot of reasons, but the main ones is they probably don't last as long. They're not easy to ship across the country or across the globe. And that doesn't mean they aren't more interesting and maybe taste better in some scenarios. So the nice thing about having a home garden is that you can grow whatever you want to because you don't have all these requirements of, you're not shipping your strawberries across America for somebody else to eat them. You're just going to eat them probably the next day after you pick them, right when you pick them. So picking interesting heirloom seeds makes gardening a lot more fun. And you might see vegetables you would never get to see in your life uh, growing in your garden, which is just an exciting thing for you and the kids at your centers. So I just kind of highlighted a few that I'm growing this year and have got me excited this year. This first one is called a rat tails radish. And normally you think of radishes as a root crop. I'm eating the actual radish root in the ground, but actually radish seed pods are delicious. And in other countries, they're part of their cuisine. India, particularly, radish seed pods are like a delicacy. And this rat tails radish is a variety of radish that is meant to be grown to eat the seed pods. And you can kind of see in the picture, they look almost like green beans, but they taste like radishes. And one radish plant will grow an abundance of these seed pods. They're really easy to grow, fun for kids to pick. Radishes are one of the easiest vegetables to grow in the garden. even in poor soil, radishes usually grow pretty well. I also have glass gem corn on here. This is a variety of corn that does not taste very good compared to, let's say, a commercial sweet corn, but it looks like a work of art. And I'm growing some in my garden this year. I'm incredibly excited to try to get them to this point, but just the idea of growing that glass gem corn, I can't imagine picking that and ever forgetting that if I was a 3 or 4 year old at one of these sites. So those are two of them. And then I have two more I wanted to highlight just when we're talking about just some fun, interesting varieties. On the left are dragon's tongue beans. There's lots of really interesting variety of beans. Beans, again, are very easy to grow. They actually put nitrogen back into the soil. Um, so, you get a lot of bang for your buck. One bean plant can produce a bunch of beans. It's almost hard to go wrong growing beans. And this is just a really interesting variety that just looks kind of amazing to me. I also have in my backyard rattlesnake beans, which look very similar, but there's lots of different types of beans that are easy to grow that look very visually stunning. And broccoli is a little harder to grow. And this might be one you buy from your local farmer's market to have a taste test with. But this one's called Romanesco broccoli. And I don't even have to tell you, it looks incredible. It also tastes very different than regular broccoli. It's more nutty. Lots of chefs use it in their high-end restaurants, but I can buy it at my local farmer's market. And you might be able to do that as well, but it's a very interesting variety of broccoli that's a few hundred years old that has just been passed down through the generations. And the last thing I'll say about heirloom seeds is that they're really special in that if you save the seeds of heirloom seeds, they'll be just like their parents. So if I buy a hybrid seed packet at Walmart or somewhere and I try to save that hybrid seed, it's not going to be like its parents. So these old heirloom seeds, you can save them. These could be the last dragon tongues bean seeds you ever have to buy because you could just save them and have dragon tongues bean next year. And saving bean seeds is also very easy, but that's a whole nother lesson in itself. And I wanted to mention a few indoor gardening activities you can do this time of year, even though we're all excited to get outside. There's still some really fun things you can do inside on a rainy day or to get ready for maybe fall or late summer gardening. And the first one is starting seeds indoors. And you really don't need much space to do this with. Even one little end table is all you'd really need to start seeds indoors with your class. And the fun thing is they can sort of check in on these seeds all the time if they're in their classroom. So they can be very involved in the growing process. And if we start seeds indoors right now, these are things we'll plant outside in the fall. So usually you want to start something inside about 6 weeks-ish before you put it outside. So I sent you all those growing zone maps last week and the planting calendar. So if I'm thinking I want kale and cabbage for my fall garden, I could start them inside in the next few weeks or months and have them ready for that fall garden later. And again, like on a rainy day, you could have this activity with your class. So you don't need very much. It's pretty inexpensive. If you have more questions about it, I'm going to share my email later, but essentially you need a seed starting mix, which is sort of a potting media that's great for seed starting. It does not have really nutrients in it, but it's great to get seeds going and get their life started. You need some seed trays, kind of like the one you see in the picture. You might need a heating mat. You don't always need a heating mat, but some seeds like tomatoes and peppers need a high temperature to get started, and then you can take the heating mat away. They make heating mats just for plants, so they're very safe to put, let's say, under this seed tray. You need some grow lights. There's lots of different options. Again, if you want to do this at your center, just send me an email. I'd love to help you out and kind of tell you what I'm doing at my house and what might be a good fit for your center. And then you just need whatever seeds you're going to plant. So a really easy activity to do in your sites, and you could teach them how to grow plants that they're going to put outside maybe in 6 or 8 weeks from now. And then hydroponics is a very intimidating word but there's a lot of hydroponic systems that, are not bigger than 2 and 3 feet wide, and you can get for less than $100 that can go in your classrooms. My son is 6 years old. I have a hydroponic system just like this one in my house. He's constantly checking on it, saying, "Dad, it needs more water. The plants aren't looking good." All that good stuff. And if it's in your classroom, they can be very hands-on with it. And this picture right here, this one's growing some mint and some basil and some dill. A lot of great things you could use or smell. And you can grow plants in here year round, and there's very little maintenance. So a system like this will come with a fertilizer that you just put in the water. And really, as long as you're giving it water and fertilizer, it's going to take care of the plants by itself. So a small system like this is a great way to get plants in the classroom. If maybe it's winter, maybe you don't have a garden space outside, it's a great way to sort of get plants in the classroom. So that's all the material I had for today. But if you have any questions about like specifics, like, where did I put my garden? What should I plant in my garden? Please feel free to email me. I love getting emails about gardening questions. It usually makes my day. But if there's any questions that y'all have just generally, I'd love to see them now in the chat. And any topics you want me to cover in 2 weeks, because 2 weeks will be my last time seeing you all this year. And so if there's any topics you want me to cover in 2 weeks, please put them in the chat and I'll be sure to talk about those in 2 weeks.
Thank you so much, Kyle. We appreciate you as always. And at this time, please feel free, like you did last week, everyone, to come off of mute, open up your screen so we can see you and ask questions. And you can also put them in the chat, okay?
This is Julie Page. More than a question, I just wanted to thank you because last week, when we met, I live in a very shaded area where last year we planted a garden and nothing took off. Like I spent so much money on little tiny miniature tomatoes and little miniature watermelons and everything came. The kids would just have this magical experience. And like I got one tomato and a couple of little mini cucumbers because there just wasn't enough sun. So I was like, I'm done with gardening with them because it was so discouraging. And then after last week, I now have Swiss chard and kale and a bunch of different lettuces growing on my back porch because they can handle the shade. And I bought a seed starting like for the microgreens. And so we're on it. So thank you.
I love that. That made my day. Glad to hear that. And honestly, some plants like shade more. Like a lettuce in full sun is going to get really bitter. It's going to go to seed. It's not even going to last very long in the summer. So, I mean, some plants are even better at your space than maybe at full sun too.
That's what I'm hoping.
Wonderful. That's what we love to hear. Oh, and let me go ahead and give respect to the backdrop that I have in back of me is not my house. It is actually a safe space in Raleigh. So that is one of their gardens that they had a few years ago that we have a picture of, and I love it so much. So
yeah, that reminds me actually, Sharonda, about maybe one of the topics is to do a little bit more with vertical gardening because maximizing space, yeah, some programs, it's don't have a whole lot. So growing up could be really helpful.
That would be because we have, lots of fencing around the playground that I feel like could be utilized for things like beans that'll climb or even cucumber vines. And I hadn't even really thought about doing that before. And that's our sunniest spot is, in that corner where the fencing is. So that makes a lot of sense.
That sounds wonderful. That's a great idea. And also, Kyle, in the chat, can you talk about slugs? Are they beneficial or not?
Yeah, I can spend a whole slide in 2 weeks talking about slugs, but slugs are not
Really?
beneficial. Yeah, we can talk about slugs for a while because they're a big garden pest too. I thought about putting them on my slides today, but I kind of ran out of time. But yeah, we can do a whole slide on slugs in 2 weeks. They're not beneficial. They'll eat your plants. They're incredibly annoying. Chickens are a great deterrent for slugs. My chickens eat all the slugs at my house, but that's not really realistic where a lot of y'all are working. So there are some good ways to deter slugs. They don't like crawling over sharp objects. So you could do something silly like surround your plants with eggshells. They're not going to like climbing over eggshells. Also, if you want to go find slugs, you find them in the morning or at night when it's cool, when there's dew on the ground. That's when they want to go hunt your plants. When it's hot outside, they're going to be hiding. So those are just a few quick things, but I can do a whole slide on slugs in a few weeks.
Wow. Okay. Thank you for that. So for the 22nd, do you think we can talk a little bit more? I know you already have something probably planned, but can we talk a little bit more or either next week a little bit about vertical gardens?
Yeah, that'll be the theme of my presentation in 2 weeks, vertical gardening. I decided not to make any slides because I'd rather hear what y'all want to learn and then kind of go off that.
Sounds great. Sounds great. I know I'm gonna be excited. I'm gonna make sure I have my spot in my backyard ready because that was a plan. I want to do something vertical, so I'll make sure it's ready in 2 weeks. And then we can all track our progress. How about that? Who else has something for me? For Kyle, I'm sorry. No more questions or comments? If not, just remember next week we have our first learning session and it will be in person. So we are very excited about that because we are returning to in person after 4 years from COVID. I mean, so this is a big deal. So we're very excited about that. That's why we did decide to not do Zoom this year. So we are really excited. If you can please talk to others in our different counties and really drum it up so that people will be there because we just want to be able to see you, touch you, actually mingle with each other so you can talk about these different things, these wonderful things going on in your centers, in your areas, and you can give each other advice as to what is working, what's not working. Especially my teachers, last time when we had our affinity group meeting, there was a big discussion with two of our centers doing excellent parent engagement activities, and that's always hard. And so if we're all together, those are things that we can map out together. So at this point, I will turn it over to Caroline just to see if there is any more general housekeeping when it comes to next week. And yeah, so I'll do that right now.
Okay, great. Well, first of all, Kyle, that was very wonderful. Thank you so much. I just am learning so much from you. The main thing that I learned is that different types of plants need different amount of sunlight. Who would have thunk it? Thank you so much. And then as far as learning session 1, everything Sharonda said is true. Emma, maybe you can throw the registration link in there if people have not registered. If you're coming from Buncombe County or Boone, we are paying for hotel rooms, but today is the last day that you can let us know that you need a hotel room. And yeah, like Sharonda said, your summer interns that are going to be working with you really closely will be there, so it'll be fun to meet them. Kyle will be there, so you can ask him any gardening questions in person, which would be fun. Yeah, we're excited. We have some great trainings, and I'm looking forward to meeting you all in person. And there's the registration link. But yeah, shoot us an email if you have any questions, and super great to see you all. And thanks again, Kyle.